Welcome back to the Lost Info podcast. As always, this is keeping you awake, Jake. The other Jake is out, so we have Kane sitting in, as you can see on my side. Today is case file 23. We have a guest. Without further ado, I'm going to go into it and introduce him. So we welcome a fantastic researcher of Lost Info, which has gathered his talents in many ways through counterespionage and counterterrorism. In his career with the FBI, Air Force of Special Investigations, other U.S. federal organizations, and the private sector work as well, he has written many books as he pulls out the threads of information in the fabric of life to unravel the truths. With a well-fitting name, Walter, meaning the ruler of armies, possibly the armies of the seekers of knowledge and finders of info, we welcome Walter Bosley.
Hey guys, how you doing?
So, Walter, we basically, I guess we're going to have all this stuff in the show notes below where they can find a lot of your work and your books and everything of that nature. We even have a cover over one of your books as our background. Like I have said before, you cover such a wide range of knowledge and material in your research that we're very excited to have you as a guest. And just for the listeners, we're not going to be able to cover a fraction of what we want, but we hope to have Walter back on in the future. Really, I guess where we're going to start this off is, and that's probably the question a lot of people want to know is, even though you had a lot of background in some of the things, what was really the fueling factor that got you into the paranormal, all the stuff that people really kind of frown upon, conspiracy? The word actually was given a negative connotation, but it really just means researching what people don't normally. So what got you into that?
Well, as a kid, I grew up on horror films and always loved a spooky story, from my parents or various relatives or just anybody. So I was inclined to the bizarre, paranormal, weird world. Like a lot of us, I had an interest in UFOs from childhood. But what really kicked it off for me, got me actively pursuing this stuff, was an experience I had in December of '79, in which I woke up one morning and everything was different. Everything I recognized everything. It was my house. There was my mom, there was my sisters, my dad, but something was odd. Something was very different with me and in my perception of things. And from that day forward, I just started having, all sorts of strange experiences over the years. And by the time I had a mentor, a very interesting guy. And by the time he got a hold of me, I had experienced some things and was pretty much wondering what the heck is going on with this stuff.
So on that, is that kind of what led you into some of the things in the Air Force and the FBI work too? Is it kind of guided you through most of your decisions, I take it, as far as career?
Well, excuse me. Yeah, what's interesting about that is my mentor, who I speak of, was an uncle of mine. He was one of my mom's brothers.
Okay.
And he had a career, and he started in the Army. And then by the time he retired in 99 or 2000, he had just over 44 years in the intel community in his career. And so, he had that background. And the way he explained it to me, he said, you kind of have a natural aptitude for this kind of stuff. I think you'd like it. But his mentorship didn't start with that. It started with the weird stuff. As we got to know each other better, I mean, when I was a kid, I remember visiting this uncle and such, but it wasn't until I was in college that he really focused his mentoring on me. And our talks started out with weird experiences he had and weird things I was interested in. And he told me one day that, if you want to learn about these weird things, you might be interested in a career, essentially in the intelligence community. Now, at that time, I had no idea there was any connection between the two. I didn't know anything about the more esoteric aspects of MK Ultra or anything. It was just all, huh? What?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so it really started with the weird, and then over the years he taught me some pretty arcane things, you know,
Well, and I think one of the big things with that is, and for people that are outside of it, is that, you know, now later on, hindsight, we look back and we're like, man, why so many cover-ups? Because we would think that if any of it's true, that we would be so much
Mhm.
farther along in technology and the ways of just ordinary life for civilization. So we look upon it like, why so many cover-ups, and why are they doing what they do to cover it up for so long? So I
Right.
guess, like, you know, you hear some of these leaks and whatnot. I mean, obviously David Wilcox covers a lot of those kind of people, and Corey Good's story is, you know, I mean, mind blowing. But it's hard to
Mm.
say, like, you know, where the story really is to the truth and the cover ups to just completely being bonkers. You know, like, you just don't know. But for the average person, like you said, when you're a child, and even me, all the way up to doing this podcast, it's always just trying to find that next little thread of information, which
Right.
may or may not lead to anything, but, you know, firsthand accounts and things like that. Like I said, about, you know, our listeners and me in general, is that you either got to call somebody a liar, or their story is a firsthand account. So I guess there was a story that I heard about, was with your dad in a crash.
Mhm.
And I guess that goes a little farther past where we wanted to go. But since we're on that, I was really curious on hearing that story.
Well, um, it, the earliest recollection I have of him telling me about this was in 1974. We were living in West Virginia at the time. It was the second time that we had lived there since I had been born. And when we lived there the first time, it was all through the Woody Dernberger, Indrid Cold, Mothman period.
Oh
We were
yeah,
living in Mineral Wells where Woody Dernberger lived, and
right.
it was right near Mineral Wells where he saw um, Indrid Cold for the first time. And now I was a small infant. I was a child. I don't remember. My vaguest recollection of that time is being in a car that we had at the time. But that's it. I was so young. But when we moved back there in the mid 70s, it was 1974. I remember that real well. That 2 years that we lived there. But my dad started telling me, and my sisters at that time as well, about having been part of a crash retrieval, was what we'd call it these days. And he had been in the Air Force in the late 50s. He was in the aerospace medicine division of the Air Force. Now, a lot of people don't realize it, but the U.S. manned space program started in the U.S. Air Force, and it was started by the Aerospace Medical Division. Okay.
Okay.
And so my dad, being in aerospace medicine, his specific job was to train pilots in using their life support systems, their oxygen
Okay.
systems, and
Yeah. Right on.
training them in how to use the pressure suits and
My
stuff.
brother's
And he
actually in the Air Force as well. He works on the ejection equipment and
Oh,
parachutes.
okay. So he's real familiar with like the altitude chambers and stuff
Sure.
like that. My dad and the guys he worked with, they ran the altitude chamber up at what used to be George Air Force Base up in Hesperia, right up the hill from me here.
Okay.
And he was back in training, an advanced training program at Gunner Air Force Base, when he and the couple of guys he worked with that were there with him, they got pulled to go deal with a special project. And when they got in the plane on their way to Texas, the plane makes a northward turn, and this intel officer comes out of the forward cabin and explains to them that they're going to Wright-Patterson, not Texas. And long story short, that was the first time he told me that he and the guys had been briefed on something that had crashed in 1947 in New Mexico, and they were told that it had happened again, and that
So the
they were
known Roswell crash, this was after.
This is what we call, in 1980, the first book about Roswell was released, and it really started hitting, the public in a big way in 1980.
There's a lot of, did it go to the Patterson Air Force Base, or did it go to Area 51, those kind of things?
Well, it wouldn't have, I don't think it would have gone to Area 51, but remember all of this. We all have to remember that all of this is human testimony.
Right.
It qualifies as hearsay. Even my dad's story qualifies as hearsay.
Absolutely.
And he and the guys were shown photographs of bodies that were retrieved in the late 40s. And he, to the day he died, vehemently said they were not little gray aliens. He said that is a falsehood that's been laid over
from the crash later, or
from
both?
Roswell.
From
Roswell. Oh,
okay.
Yeah, neither one was gray aliens, but he said what they were shown were human beings that essentially were identical to us, but less like little to no body hair.
Yeah. Okay.
And they were a little smaller in stature, but they weren't. He said they weren't little beings, and they sure as heck. He insisted for years after this gray thing. He says that they were not gray aliens. So they were shown all this, briefed in, and then they were flown out to Arizona, and they were told that a crash had happened, but they were going to be part of a rescue operation because the pilot had not been killed. Now, this was from another civilization other than ours. I'm just telling you the story he told.
Right.
And they had come to us, whoever, it eventually got down to the Air Force, of course, and said, hey, we really want nothing to do with your civilization, but we need help getting our guy back home. And that was what my dad said they were told. And then he was flown out to Arizona. And
was that now off planet, or maybe an inner Earth civilization?
They were. He always said that he was told that they kind of co-inhabited this planet with us, and their civilization was based subterranean, and they had gone underground thousands of years ago when there had been a natural cataclysm.
And I think we hear more and more about that, actually. I mean, even me in research, that the inner Earth, or it goes all the way back to General Byrd talking about when he flew into, Antarctica, or this big opening. But more and more you start to hear stories of an inner Earth that kind of shine light that maybe it's possible that there's a civilization that was a breakaway civilization, as you'd say.
I guess technically they would have been a breakaway because according to what my dad said he was told, they had gone underground during a natural cataclysm on the surface, and they had chosen, this particular group of humans had chosen to stay under there. And to whatever extent, whatever technology they possessed at that time, they continued to develop their technology in a different direction than the humans who chose to return to the surface. And so they, they have shared this world with us, is what he said he was told. In my book, I go into his story. I approach it as a professional investigator. And I even have to question my dad's story, and I find a possible history-based explanation for his story, particularly if his story was not true, the one he was telling. And that would have to do with what the Air Force was specifically doing with MK Ultra and laying false narratives in the human psyche to bury classified projects at the time. In the
I was
late
actually
50s.
going to say, when you brought that up, do you think that they might have used that same technique on people that have worked for the Air Force in order to continue this cover up, or what information they would not want out?
That is exactly what I suspect. And here's the thing with all of this stuff. You mentioned, we read stories, we hear stories. You mentioned sometimes it's got to come down to, you give someone the benefit of the doubt or you call them a liar. And quite honestly, sometimes some people need to be called out for lying because, you scratch the surface on their story and you find out that it's BS. And the tough thing about that is I'm coming from the perspective, despite what you hear me say about, the numbers of UFO sightings and what percentage I think are this, that, and the other, not ET, I'm a firm believer. I accept that there must be intelligent extraterrestrial civilizations out in the universe. To me, that's logical. And they have and do come here. That said, we have to be careful about stories we hear and about things people say and claim, because unfortunately, this is a fascinating and, quite honestly, can be a very fun subject. And some people make stuff up for attention.
I was going to say, well, in the past, maybe, well, I don't know, even then it is possible, but nowadays, even more so, being that you can pretty much reach anybody in the world at any given time with our social medias and everything of that nature. It does become like, is it for the clicks? Is it for, the money, the attention?
Right.
The one thing that I think that is important is that we have to realize that there's enough stories. And like you said, on numbers, as far as intelligent life, there has to be something to it. They can't all just be made up. But it doesn't help when the waters are muddied by people that are lying.
It doesn't help at all. In fact, that's a whole topic in itself. How much of that is done on purpose? How much of that is, just a thread of disinformation being laid through our community's narrative and through the research. And so this is why, and it's a tough call, because the other social phenomenon in our particular culture, if you want to call it that, is this idea that, well, hey, Walter, you write about and advocate this, and this. How can you be critical of that, and that? Because that's not right. If you're going to advocate this, then you must show respect to that. And I say, baloney. No, I do not have to show. For instance, flat Earth, and we didn't go to the moon. Okay. I've heard enough from those people. I've heard everything, all their arguments. It has been picked apart. It has been shown to be.
See, and so me being that I don't know those two topics, I don't believe that the one way, but I can't prove the other. So I still will listen to the debate and see if I can find any credibility. I mean, they do make some points that are hard to grasp, but then again, like if you've followed it for probably way longer than I have, you can tie things together and pick apart.
All you have to do, like when they, for instance, they're one of their favorite ones, and not to go off on this tangent because it's giving them attention they do not deserve. That's coming from me. Think about that. Is the Van Allen belt thing. You go in and look at the science of the Van Allen belts. You go look in and see exactly how NASA dealt with that, and you'll realize these guys are either completely ignorant of the facts, or to keep their discussion going, they're leaving those facts out, or they're just saying, well, I don't buy those facts. Well, okay, you can have your opinion, but you don't get your own facts.
In 1969, let's say that they did get there. Wasn't there recently found that 700 pages of or 700 files of how they actually went through the Van Allen's belt and how they got there have been missing? So do you think that maybe when they did go to the moon, that they saw something that they just couldn't relay to humans at the time?
That's another topic. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with the idea that once they got up there, they saw some stuff that we still haven't been told about. Yeah, no problem with that at all. Okay. But believe me, I've looked at it. I've heard the argument that we did not go is it is. I just call it ridiculous when you look close enough. And I personally choose not to be entangled in that, going nowhere.
Well, I would definitely take somebody as of your stature and the way you research. I would definitely be more inclined to listen to somebody like you than a guy that's watched a couple of YouTube videos and say, "Oh, we never went." You know what I mean?
And it's almost that ridiculous. But again, that's
kind of the flat earthers too. I mean, it's like, you say a couple things and it's like you spent maybe a year looking into some questions and then you go out there and preach it as this is how it is, it's hard to take that serious.
Yeah,
I guess,
and my whole point is that you know, you do some things in our community, you do have to make a decision, and you do have to say, you know, just because I think this is possible, no, I've looked at that and I'm not buying it. And that's okay. You have to avoid this thing where everything is valid, everything is possible, everything is okay, because that's quite simply not the way it is, not the truth.
Well, I think for me anyway, it's hard when it comes to government things, like when the government gets involved and says one of the ways, it's almost like a lot of the things they've done over, you know, Project Northwoods and MK Ultra and all these projects that have been very secretive and covered up. It's like, all right, if the government says it, then I don't want to believe it. So you almost want to go the opposite way. But again, it's like, if you kind of in that whole open scenario that anything's possible, it's kind of hard to grasp anything at all.
Well, you have to, like anything, you have to be, and this is the difficult thing. A lot of people just don't want to do it because they don't trust your own judgment, trust your critical thinking. Okay, you could be wrong. I mean, I will be talking about my stuff, and I will gladly identify to you what I think. I always say I could be wrong on some of my speculations, but you know, with the whole thing about the government and what they say, yeah, you got to be selective. Now, there's going to be some things that, you know, here's the thing: they're not going to be lying about everything. Right. So I mean, you have to look at that.
Well,
and go, okay,
and I do think
what could they be lying about? What are they?
Some of it probably is for the protection, because even though there's other outside thinkers that would be able to handle it, we also have to realize that the majority of the population, especially at the time in 1947, would not be able to handle that.
Sure.
So national security does actually mean something. It's just at this point, after this long of cover-ups. And I mean, they have released the Navy video that they did specify it was an unidentified craft that they couldn't. So maybe they're slowly coming around to maybe opening up a few things. I don't know. Hopefully.
Oh, well, I'm not a popular guy with a certain crowd where that's concerned, because I do not think, I think maybe Commander Fravor and the pilots of that squadron and people on the, you know, whatever the nearby ships were, I think it was unidentified to them. But I don't think it was unidentified at all to the Air Force intelligence officers who showed up on the bridge of the ship and demanded the recordings, because I think what the Tic Tac was a test of advanced prototype technology, in spite of all ours. But it went too fast. Yeah.
Okay.
It went too fast. It turned to blah blah blah. Our stuff can't do that. The fact is, you don't know what our experimental stuff can or cannot do unless you're working on the project and you're briefed in 100%.
Absolutely. Well, that goes into, you know, some of the stories Bob Lazar, if they were working on those any kind of those things and propulsions of different sorts.
Right.
I mean, the Blackbird didn't even come out till 30 years after it was already made to the public. So you can just imagine, you fast forward in time and they might have stuff from 50 years ago that's not let up to the public. So absolutely.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Well, and you bring up the SR-71. Now, I remember having an SR-71 toy around 1970 or 71. And by 1978 and 9, the SR-71 was being flown at air shows for the publicly. But what they were hiding from us was some facts about the SR-71. For instance, that the pilots are given astronaut wings, because that airplane, we're told, skips, you know, into orbit. Well, what I learned about it subsequently is it don't just skip into orbit; it can go up there, just, you know, and that's why the pilots wear astronaut wings. But also the CIA's version of the SR-71 they were keeping really secret because of that drone that was on that would piggyback on it. Okay. And the drone looks suspiciously like what people who preach the ET hypothesis for Roswell looks suspiciously like the so-called Roswell craft that I think the tester model company came out.
I believe that there was they were shipping, or it was on the back of a truck going through Missouri. Some people had took videos of it and whatever else, and claimed that they were shipping a UFO right through the street, but that was said to be a drone of some sort. Which, I mean, well, and the thing is, like, when people see something like that, or the population in general, and they feel like everything's being covered up, they'll latch on to stuff like that for sure.
Sure. And it's easy too, because, people, it's exciting. And when things like this, make it to the bubble up to the surface, in front of public eyes, we're completely out of the loop.
Yeah.
But when I hear, based on my experience in the Air Force, what I did and what I was exposed to, when I hear a military pilot make the comment, that if it was ours, I would have known about it.
Yeah.
I just, the face palm, shake my head. I'm like, Commander, better than that statement.
I was gonna
because
say,
that's just not the case.
If you don't rank at the highest of
no, it's not just rank. It's if you don't have need to know, if you're not part of specifically a project.
Well, I was going to say, the president,
I don't care how hot shot of a pilot you are, you're not going to be briefed in because you're.
And the president is on that too, on need to know, because technically they're a part-time employee, and I don't think that they know a lot. Maybe.
Well, you got to qualify that. That's another. Gosh, I don't. Your audience, some of them's probably going to hate me, but
no.
Here's
Actually,
the thing
just you tell it as you do. I like to speculate that and that'd be my opinion, is that the president probably doesn't know a lot of things, based on that we have organizations that have, I guess, done things in the past, the CIA and probably even NSA and things of that nature, that there's no reason for the president to know. It only makes him liable for knowing.
Well, and what you said right there goes to describing what it really is like. Sure, there's certain specific little operational details that the president may not be briefed on. Okay, they're briefed on the basics. I have a personal example with this. After the end of the Cold War, I was working for the FBI. I was a Russian translator, and basically my job is to sit on a wiretap, as we call it, and monitor wiretapped conversations that KGB and GRU agents were making on the phone, talking with sources. This was back in Manhattan, and I specifically worked on GRU targets, which is the Russian military's, CIA, so to speak. And when the wall fell and the coup happened and the fall of the Soviet Union happened, the concern was keeping account of all their nuclear weaponry. Okay. And so I did a cut. I can't go into the details, but I did a cut that, I wrote up my log, did my analysis, turned it in. A couple weeks later, my boss, or the squad secretary, comes out. We worked at an undercover site. She says, "Hey, Walter, the boss wants to talk to you for a minute." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I went to the boss's office, and he says, "Hey, close the door." Like, yeah, okay. He says, "Just want to let you know that your cut on such and such was briefed at the top." And I said, "Oh, the director knows I exist." And he kind of smiled. He goes, "I'm not talking about the director. It was briefed in the action." I forgot what he called it then. He goes, it was briefed to the president. And my jaw dropped. I'm like, wait, at the time, I believe President Bush. He's like, "Yeah." And I go, "So he knows of my existence?" And he laughed. He goes, "Don't get excited. You're identified as source number 9713. So no, of course he didn't know. He wasn't told, "Hey, this knucklehead Walter Bosley with the FBI," no, he's told, that little bit, but I'm just a number, so, and that's to protect my cover and protect the FBI source and stuff like that. So that's an example and also, my bona fides for knowing wherefore I speak. That's just one example of how that works. But I guarantee you, this stuff, when you hear these guys say they claim to have been special forces, and they go on some popular radio show or podcast or something, they're saying we were working on UFO stuff that not even the president had a need to know. The president wasn't briefed in on this. And I want you to first think about that on the face of it. this jamoke is saying this on a
Right.
a paranormal radio show,
Well, that's
something
like
that
even
the president of the United
that was even like
yeah
on
the United States isn't briefed in
on the SEAL Team 6 when the guy wrote the book about getting Osama bin Laden. It was like, I don't know, there's a lot of information that you shouldn't be telling, I don't think, if you were in that group. But
well,
I don't know.
that situation, that's all thought out and planned out, and they decide what's going to go out. But the idea, and I've heard people say this,
Right.
People have tried to get me into arguments over this, and it's ridiculous that the president isn't briefed in on UFO stuff and I mean, it's like, how many times have you watched Independence Day? Way too many times, where he says, how come I wasn't I guarantee you, whoever the president of the United States is at any given time, probably the first serious briefing they get after being sworn in, of the top 3 topics, I'm going to tell you, if there truly are extraterrestrials coming to this planet that we know of, that's one of the things, if not number one, he or she will get briefed on. And this idea that the president, no matter what, some guy is going to say, oh, that Bosley, he's an a-hole, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Baloney, I do know what I'm talking about. I guarantee you the president gets briefed in on this stuff. It may be the basics, but it's the heart, the most important basics. Right. It may not be the personnel and stuff.
Well, but you hear some of the stories knows. Like with John F. Kennedy that was talking about that he wanted to go to Area 51 and that the military or the CIA wouldn't let him at one point in time, and that he said if he wasn't let in there, that he was going to take the military and storm it himself. And those are kind of stories. Was that Eisenhower?
I think it was Ike.
So
yeah.
I think those are I apologize on
because they say the film 7 Days in May was based on that.
Okay. And I think those are the stories people dwell on, to where, the president must not know of these things because they hide it from even him. So I think that's where it goes.
And that was certain operational things. Yeah. They might try to do that. Yeah.
Okay, so that we're gonna go back a little bit, but before that, real quick, there's another story that I heard with a mentor of yours that might have maybe told you something in Antarctica or
right,
and that was another interesting topic that I kind of wanted to go into a little bit.
Oh, well, what's interesting about that, because it's very timely with our recent couple of years, right? I was told in the mid 1990s that around 1960, a hole had been discovered under the ice. They whatever they were digging into the ice or whatever. But I was told that a huge hole had been found going deep into the terrain under the ice, and that massive, big, large machinery that was very ancient was found down in this hole. And there were these beings. These were small in stature beings. Okay. The way they were described to me was they came up to a human, your knee, essentially. Wow. That's how short they were. And they weren't described as having a big head and black eyes. But my uncle, my mentor, told me this in the mid 90s. Now, by this time, I'm already an Air Force officer. I'm an OSI agent. Okay. Right. And he's telling me this, and he's telling me, this is on the QT. I'm not supposed to talk about this, publicly or with anybody. But and also the other part of that story was that it scared the hell out of the scientists and the guys on the expedition that found this hole. So we start there with the basics,
right?
Okay. In 1960, big hole is found. Ancient machinery scares the hell out of the guys who find it. Okay. Then right. Zoom ahead to just a couple of years ago. And what is popular? Oh, scientists have just found a big hole under the ice in Antarctica.
There was a time when all the leaders started traveling there, and everybody was
that's part of what I was going to say is they're finding these this ancient civilization, and it scared the hell out, it made the scientists who found it catatonic, and yeah, then these leaders start going down there, and I thought, well, that's interesting, because that's the same thing I was told, but I was told in the mid 90s, and I was told that it happened in 1960. But this new version is that they essentially just found it recently, right. And they change a little bit, and they add some stuff, but it's essentially the same thing.
The machinery was that, so, and the little beings were active, or were they bodies of the beings?
No, they were alive.
Okay.
What happened, to show you the personal connection to this, I had a friend, these two friends that were neighbors of mine before I started working for Uncle Sam. They were this older couple. They were kind of like a surrogate grandparents for me. Okay, they were just this nice old couple, and they were into UFOs and strange things, and at least the lady was. Her name is Louise, and her husband Eddie. And Eddie was real quiet about this stuff, but it was kind of interesting. Eddie would disappear for hours at a time, and Louise would be worried about him. And then he'd come wandering back, and he's like, "Oh, you know me, Louise. I went to the bookstore and, just kind of got lost track of time and such." When he died in 87, their apartment was broken into, like within less than a week. Now, Eddie had been a veteran. I was told he'd been in the Air Force. He was an enlisted guy, got out as a staff sergeant, and went into being a medical, like an in-home, what we call a nurse today, but they had the different title for it because it was a guy doing it. You know how things were. Yeah. So that's all I knew about his Air Force career. But when you're a veteran, you can, if you have conditions, you can get free medicine if you're willing to let them try new medicines that the FDA is still testing. And Eddie was getting free heart medicine, and what's interesting was, just a few days after he died, someone broke into their apartment. And she called me. She goes, "There's been a break-in. The police just left, but I've got to show you something." Okay, so I went over there, and she said, "Okay, come here." She showed me how in their bedroom, where the window had been broken, so they could reach in and slide it open. And then she said, "Now look at this." And she showed me her jewelry box full of jewelry. She said, "Nothing's missing." She goes, "Look at that right there next to it. What is that?" I go, "That's an envelope of cash, probably a couple of $100." She goes, "Yep, not a penny of that's missing." And she says, "The TV's not missing." I go, "Well, they broke in. Did they take anything?" She said, "They took Eddie's medicine, but not all of it. They only took the stuff he got from the VA." And then she goes, "Now there's more." She showed me this cigar box that was full of all sorts of different foreign currencies, a lot of it, from the other side of the Iron Curtain. Then she showed me this, she went to the closet and she pulled out, she goes, this money and this jacket were never in this house before this break-in. And it was an Arctic parka Air Force issue parka from late 50s, early 60s era. Okay. And it had his, they'll have your name, and the rank on it was major. Well, I was never told that he was an officer. And she says, "I've never seen this jacket before." So then she showed me one last thing, and it was in this other room, and it was the bottom drawer on an old Chester drawer they weren't using, an old bureau they hadn't been, they really didn't use that much. And there were 2 men's toupees of different colors and several different pair of eyeglasses. So I'm thinking, now remember, this is before I start working for the FBI and stuff. So zip ahead. I've worked for the FBI. Now I'm an OSI agent, and I'm chief of double agent operations branch at Wright Pat and all this stuff. And I had asked years before, when I was right as I was starting with the FBI, I had asked my mentor, what was going on with Eddie? And he said, "I'll tell you about that, but not now." So, then we zip ahead to what I described. I'm in the Air Force and such. And I say, "Now, seriously, what happened with Eddie?" And then we went for a walk, and he explained to me, he says, "Eddie was born in England. He was British intel. He was over here on kind of an exchange program. His cover was the man you knew. He worked for the U.S. Air Force in the late 50s, early 60s, and he said, "Remember when Louise told you that she was told by the Red Cross when he got deployed that he had died?" I'm like, "Yeah." And then 11 months later, he shows up on her doorstep, and he said, "Yeah, well, what happened was he went to Antarctica." And this is when he told me about that. Remember, this is around 96, 97. Right. And my uncle's telling me that Eddie goes to Antarctica. He said, he says, those times when Eddie would disappear. I'm like, "Yeah." He says, he wasn't at the bookstore. He was over at Norton Air Force Base, translating for intel people there. And he was still working. And so he was very much involved in the intel world, blah, blah, blah. So he painted this whole picture of this guy, which now I understood because I had been in the game. And he said that he encountered the little people down in Antarctica and saw this machinery. But when he encountered the little beings, he said that they could speak telepathically, and he said Eddie just about lost his mind. He was in a mental hospital, a mental ward for several months.
Yeah, they'll throw you for a loop.
Going to make it. Yeah, they didn't think he was going to make it, so they told his wife he'd been killed, and then he made it. For whatever reason, they went ahead and let him return to his life. And so he tells me the story, and I'm like blown away.
Yeah.
Wow, this is wild. And I, of course, keep it to myself, keep it secret. And then, of course, years later, I hear this Antarctica stuff, the same basic thing, but the timeline is off. So what I think about all this right now is I have to wonder, okay? I have to wonder. One way to test someone, to test whether you can trust them with secrets, is to ink the waters. I've done it. It's just a tool that you do. Yep. You tell somebody in trust, "Hey,
something,
this and this," and you tell them, "Yeah, you can't talk about this." So then if you hear it, you can trace it back to, "Okay, you ran your mouth. We can't trust you."
Right.
So what I think is going on with this Antarctica thing. Now, mind you, it's a separate issue about, I agree that there's probably something under that ice about the history of this planet they don't want us to know about. But I think it's very possible that they have used or are using whatever the foundation of truth is about Antarctica. I think they're using that as a water ink, so to speak. And I think it was used on me in the mid 90s. And I think it was used again on people in our community, or used on military people who then came to our community with this stuff. And the whole thing is well, the basic narrative is simply not true. It's just something that, or maybe part of it's true.
I was going to say, I always find that there's probably a little truth in everything. It's just how it's laid out.
In a lot of things, yeah. That's how I prefer to look at it.
So do you think
that's what I found?
Possibly in Project High Jump, when we went down to Antarctica to follow up what the Nazi Germany had done, going down there, do you think that there was something maybe connected with that they'd found something, maybe not to the level of
and we'd all love to know, but yes, I think whatever the truth is of what my mentor told me, whatever the truth is of what these people are hearing in recent years, whatever's really going on, that they're showing all this interesting collection of people that were going down there at a particular time, whatever the truth is, I think it does very much have to do with whatever actually happened with Byrd and that fleet. Because remember, they were supposed to be down there for months, and they came back after just weeks
with a limp, and basically with a limp.
Now some of that we hear about Byrd is just flat out not true. And for instance, unfortunately, the popular thing about the diary and him flying into the hollow earth, that's a fabrication.
The diary came out after he died, I believe, by maybe somebody that said they knew him. And so, there's a lot that gets extended upon that was not from his mouth. And
my understanding is that it is one of the true things about this is that when he returned, remember, he made that comment to that Chilean newspaper on the way home.
Right.
that got published. But then my understanding, until it's demonstrated not to be true otherwise, is that the briefing that he gave certain members of Congress remains to this day classified, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, because I think he went on an interview, and then whatever he had said, they told him, you can't talk about any of this anymore.
Right.
And that was
right.
the one and only interview I think
Right.
that he had that alluded to some things happening in Antarctica.
The thing that's in the favor of it being some type of Nazi secret is, think about it. It's 1940. It was 1947, before Roswell, and here the Allies have defeated Nazi Germany, and we're told that that Nazi threat is no more. They're gone.
Right.
Don't worry about it, folks. You're safe from the Nazis. So imagine if there was some type of Nazi holdout down there with some type of, for its time, advanced technology. I do not for a minute buy into the Hanabu thing, and there's reasons why. That's nonsense, but something advanced, something they found down there. And imagine trying to tell the public, we didn't get all of them,
Yeah.
So I could see them keeping that secret. But then the other thing that's going on, remember, by 1947, we had already rushed headlong into the building Cold War too. So we wanted to keep it secret from those guys.
Well, I guess that's a good segue into some of the things with Nazi Germany that you've researched, with the amount of technology that they were on the brink of, and it kind of goes into the Aero Club and some of the funding that I think I think a lot of people believe if they had went any longer, it could be a whole different scenario. Sure. Based on all the scientists and the things that they were on the edge of. So if you want to maybe elaborate just a little bit on that, because I know we're not going to be able to cover near of it. We're close to the hour for you, but if you want to maybe go into some of the research you did on that. Yeah.
Well, first I want to say, early on, when you mentioned all the different diverse things that I've researched and written about, here's the wild thing about that. One book has led to the other. All of my stuff is connected by like two threads, and it's as mind-blowing to me as it might seem to somebody who hasn't read my stuff. It's like, what do you mean? There's Disneyland, there's a cult murder 100 years ago in San Bernardino, there's Nazi breakaways. What the heck? What do you mean all tied together? And when you read the books, you see. So one book really did lead to the next for me, but with this particular thing, there's this mysterious group called the Sonora Aero Club, and they were affiliated with this even more mysterious group called NIMSA, and this comes from one person, and that's Charles Delshow. I do not buy for a minute that he was just an outsider artist making all this up. I'm sorry, you dig into it, you see the research that was already done, you do some of your own, and you have to be just in flat out denial to say, oh, this was all just fabricated. But that said, what I did was I started looking at things. The Sonora Aero Club, according to Delshow, dates back to the 1850s, and they were building proof of concept prototype flying machines, what we would call specifically, and even if it's a misnomer, we would call it anti-gravity. Okay, it was powered flight, but it wasn't airplanes with propellers, and it was not hot air balloons. It was these things called aeros, AERO, and they had attained lift and propulsion with this, what is essentially the Mercury, I said that backwards, the Mercury vortex engine, which had spinning elements and had this liquid, which we don't know what the actual makeup of this liquid was, because the leader of the Sonora Aero Club, a guy named Peter Menace, kept that recipe secret. Well, according to Delshow, they allegedly disbanded after Menace allegedly dies in the late 1850s. And then, in the 1890s, we have the airship mystery. So and that has,
was it like the green liquid is what you're talking about? Was it
the green liquid, the soup? Yeah.
Okay.
And so you get to the 1890s, And you have these larger flying machines with spinning things and this rotating propulsion device with this liquid that's dripping and causing the chemical reaction. Anyway, what they looked to me like were more advanced versions of what the Sonora Aero Club was doing in the 1850s, almost 40 years before, 30 some years before. So I thought, okay, there's got to be a connection there. Absolutely. Okay, between the 1850, the Sonora Aero Club, and the 1890s airship mystery. Okay, and through this, there was always the German connection, because the Sonora Aero Club were a bunch of German immigrants working in California. Back then, that was where they could have secrecy, and they were affiliated with this larger group, according to Delschau, called NIMSA, which Delschau says was created and headquartered in Germany. But he would refer to them as the Prussians, of course, because that's in the 1850s. There was no Germany; it was Prussia. And I saw the German thread running from that to the airship mystery era. However, the airships in the airship mystery in the United States were not German when you look at the details. So I thought, well, who were these guys? Okay, they were some type of offshoot of the Sonora Aero Club, because Sonora Aero Club did not like NIMSA. Right. So then you follow the thread, the German thread, from the 1850s through the airship mystery era. You see German scientists doing and industrialists doing things that are very similar to the technology in the airships. And then in the 1920s, you have things emerging with the emergence of Nazi Germany that are right in line with this thread of German technology research. And that leads to the legendary Bell. Essentially, the Bell is an advanced version of what the Sonora Aero Club was doing, so exact that if you look at Delschau's drawings from the pre-19, he died in 1923. When you look at his drawings in the 1890s, he drew one of these machines from the 1850s, and he has a schematic that is the Nazi Bell of the 20th century.
So in your opinion, is the Bell more, and it's just an aircraft rather than some theories of time travel? And
well, no, the Bell was a device that it was an early stage device that could have been used for propulsion, for energy. It did have weird properties that messed with time. It turned living organic materials, be it plant or people. It really affected some of the scientists working on it, according to the sources, came down with, I don't want to say cancer, but something like that. Yeah. It killed plants. It turned plants into this black sludge, this goo. So basically it was this intense,
possibly destroying cells
of this new kind. Now it looks to me, based on what Delschau, remember, Delschau died before Nazi Germany ever happened. So he did all his drawings decades before the Bell, we're told the Bell was developed, but these were all Germans. So I laid out a thread from Delschau, through these particular Germans that would have been the guys to do this, and on into the World War II era. So that's as short as I could possibly do. Yeah. That's the overview of that research.
And some of that funding kind of overlaps into, I've heard that the Bush family, even before Prescott, kind of goes into some of the funding into Nazi Germany's research on, or at least really technology.
The earliest legitimate tracing to that actually you can find is Prescott, and Prescott was involved in banking at that time. Right. And remember, they were, I think they were indicted for essentially providing banking services to Nazi Germany, when clearly, before we got into the war.
Right.
Same with the oil companies. Remember, I believe it was Standard Oil. They were approached. They were confronted. Yeah, they were confronted with this, and they said, "Hey, what are you complaining about? We're selling to both sides, and we're giving America a lower price."
Yeah. Yeah.
That was their response to being told
Yeah,
you're
that's
aiding and
messed up.
abetting an enemy.
Yeah, that's
You know,
messed up.
but that's
But we find ourselves
you
in that same predicament.
American
And
industrialists.
yeah, I was gonna say we find that predicament now even in the same is that if they can make a profit, they'll turn it any way they can.
Yeah, exactly.
Without probably going too much into time and this way we can kind of leave a lot open so we can have you on in the future again and cover a lot of other topics. We do appreciate your time, and it was very exciting for me, having followed your work for a long time, to get to talk to you and present you to our fans as well. So with that, I really thank you, Walter.
Sure. Thanks for having me on. I really like talking about this stuff, and I really don't rain on all parades. It's just you happen to touch on some things that I have looked at, and you know, I got to be honest.
Kind of with the Lost Info podcast, it's a global discussion, and with a discussion, you have to have debate on whether that is plausible or not. And being that you've done a lot of research, that's what we want. We don't want, you know, everybody to just fall into this category with the whole conspiracies, everything's real. It's got to be a discussion on what we can find as truth.
And you know what? Like I said, I like to be upfront when talking about my hypotheses and ideas. I'm one of those. I could be wrong about my, you know, certain conclusions. I absolutely, you know, will say, hey, I could be wrong about this or that. So I'm not afraid to admit when I am wrong about something. So
well, we appreciate
and that's important
that.
to do.
And yeah, it's all part of that discussion. Is that if you came on and said I'm absolutely right about everything, then nobody would probably believe you,
right? that would make me look like a real jerk, you know, beyond you know what I do already to some. But thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Yeah, we definitely will have you on for more because, like I said, we didn't even cover some of the topics that I wanted to ask you on. However, the hour went faster than normal because obviously I'm invested in all this stuff as well. So, again, very excited to have you on, and we thank you, Walter.
Okay, thank you.
All right. With that, we are out of here. Peace.